there's already a certain amount of pushback from Gen Z and even, the younger Gen Zs who aren't even in the electorate yet. There's like, what the hell? I mean, what is this stuff? I mean, it's not that cool to be woke anymore, right? Hello out there in podcast land. This is Rui Teixeira, your host for the Liberal Patriot Podcast. And today we're going to, as usual, bring you one of the very most interesting and stimulating guests in our quest for the most provocative and useful heterodox conversation. And today I have Coleman Hughes. Now, Coleman is the author of a new book, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. He's also a columnist for the Free Press. I believe you're a CNN analyst, is that right?
Yes.
Forbes 30 under 30, you write for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. You've got a great podcast, which I do recommend to everybody, Conversations with Coleman, and you maintain a Substack, Coleman's Corner. But it's interesting, the way I really first ran into you, Coleman, was in the pages of Quillette. That sort of, reasonably well-known heterodox publication. And, I was regularly checking it out, and all of a sudden I run into these pieces by Coleman Hughes, generally speaking on race politics, woke politics, whatever. And I thought, man, this stuff is really good. This is really well-reasoned. This is empirical. This is logical. This guy isn't afraid to say what he thinks, regardless of what the conventional wisdom is. And, then it turns out you're an undergraduate at Columbia University. So I thought, who the hell is this guy? And where did he come from? This is fascinating. So maybe you could start by walking us through your evolution that got you into the pages of Quillette while you were an undergraduate at Columbia. I know you probably told this story a number of times, but I think our listeners might be interested in hearing just the basic sketch.
Yeah, so the short version, and some of this is in the beginning of the book, if you want kind of the longer version. But the short version is I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, which was a very racially diverse town that was a liberal town. And the kind of liberalism that was in the air was a Martin Luther King style liberalism where you don't judge people by the color of their skin. That was the dominant ethic. I got to Columbia when I was 18 years old, and that was the first time I experienced wokeness as a dominant culture of my surrounding community, and it was it was jarring and different because the ethic was not to not judge people on the basis of the color of their skin. It was very much to judge people on the basis of the color of their skin, in a kind of reversal of the old-fashioned style American white supremacist bigotry. It was kind of that turned on its head, where it was actually better to be a person of color. It was cooler and more higher status to be a person of color, and so forth. And the difference between that philosophy and the philosophy I had grown up with bothered me. I began writing just for myself in a Google Doc, trying to understand why it is that the kids around me were so deeply pessimistic about American race relations, about the persistence of racism in what appeared to me to be one of the least racist environments on planet Earth, at least if you're measuring anti-black racism. Mm-hmm. Like I was in a place where I was less likely to be called the N-word than almost anywhere, any other zip code in America by far. Yet people spoke of white supremacy, and they spoke of experiencing white supremacy on campus every day. So I wanted to square this circle. I began writing for myself, for nobody really. Tried to write for the campus newspaper, which was not receptive. And then maybe 2 years into school, I came across an article by Christian Gonzalez in Quillette about the difference between MLK and Malcolm X. I got to the bottom, thought it was a very good article, and it said he was an undergrad at Columbia. So I reached out to him. Yeah. Uh-huh. He's still one of my best friends to this day. But I figured if he could write for this Quillette thing, and I'd known about Quillette a bit. I figured if he could do it, then I could do it. And Quillette, at least in those days, was in the habit of reading every submission they get. So I just cold submitted, and started writing for them.
Now, you said that the campus newspaper wasn't really willing to publish your stuff. How did they handle that? Did they just, say no, 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 or did they explain why they wouldn't publish your stuff?
Well, I think I ultimately got 2 pieces through in my 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, their process, I'm not sure if they really had a norm of like telling you why they rejected your piece.
Okay.
But to say they had a liberal bias is not even accurate. They had an extremely far left woke bias.
Mm-hmm.
And so anything to the right of that was met with deep resistance, like extreme over editing and certain
right.
like hostile quote unquote fact checking.
Yeah, I know what that's
or just
about.
outright rejection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it does raise an interesting question and something I wrestle with, and it sounds like you were wrestling with when you were first starting to write about this stuff. I mean, how does this happen, right? I mean, here we are at Columbia University, one of the elite institutions in the world, full of elite, presumably smart people, and yet there's this like kind of wacky ideology that's completely hegemonic. I mean, where did this come from? Did they learn it, in high school? Is it a network effect where once a certain amount of people believe X, everybody winds up believing X? Or what did you finally decide was at the root of this hegemony, this sort of this kind of atmosphere where you really just couldn't discuss certain things?
So in terms of the ideology, I won't rehearse the whole origin of it. I mean, there's tons of books about this now, but
sure.
It goes back to the 70s. You've got CRT, you've got intersectionality. You've got this ideology has been around for a long time, but it's been marginal. You'd never encounter it unless you were in a certain kind of teacher's college or a certain segment of a certain grad school. I think what really mainstreamed it was in 2013 when everyone had smartphones and camera-enabled smartphones and social media.
Mm-hmm.
We, for the first time as a country, began to see this deluge of cell phone camera videos of black people getting killed by the cops in ambiguous situations or in seemingly murderous situations in some cases. Mm-hmm. That's what obviously started the BLM movement, but more broadly, it made people receptive to this long existing ideology which said that white supremacy, though the civil rights movement won, though Jim Crow is gone, white supremacy is still every bit as much embedded in an even more surreptitious way now than it was in the past. It made a lot of liberals, it made a lot of liberals and Democrats in particular receptive to this ideology, which had seemed just a little bit wacky before then. Mm-hmm. Events seemed to be proving the ideology not crazy. Mm-hmm. And I think that was at the root of it. That empowered the ideologues. Many of the kids at Columbia, myself included, did get a dose of that ideology in high school. So to your point, that's one aspect of it too. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the important thing to say about that is we now know, and we've known for years, that the idea that there was an open season on black men being killed by the cops isn't empirically not true. That people were being misled by unrepresentative set of video clips that are algorithmically boosted, and as understandable as the whole moment was, it was also based on a falsehood.
Yeah, no, the empirics were pretty shaky, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Maybe back to this sort of what originally inspired you, what people were throwing overboard with such zeal in the 2010s, the original vision of a colorblind society, of what the civil rights movement really stood for, people like Martin Luther King, obviously Bayard Rustin, and so on. It's kind of extraordinary to the point where now if you talk, and you talk about this in your book, talk about a colorblind society, or you even quote the famous, be judged by the content of your character, that's not right-coded, right? I mean, it's kind of like, that's not what good liberal or people on the left say. Now, to me, this is just so extraordinary, being a bit older than you, I grew up with the civil rights movement and very much identified with it. And these were like great ideas, right? I mean, this is about universalism, humanism, about we're all equal, about, you shouldn't treat anyone different because of the color. That's bad. Discrimination is bad. Tolerance is good. And, we can aspire to move in that direction. So how did people get to the point where they like reject that idea almost? It's almost like you're on the other team if you say that you believe in that stuff. I mean, to me, this is just extraordinary because those original ideas were so beautiful and good and, consistent with sort of the overall stream of uplift of civilization. So, I wonder what happens where people like buy into this stuff. Do they just sort of turn off their brains or something, or what? What drives them to such illogical and weird conclusions?
So in my view, two things happened. One was that the colorblind principle reached the height of its force and relevance in the early mid-60s. March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was as close to an enshrinement of colorblindness in law as you could find, really. But then right after what were supposed to be the greatest successes in American race relations based on the principle of colorblindness, you had a wave of race riots sweep the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that would seem to be a contradiction on its face, right? Like, how is it that the response to the greatest forward step in race relations based on colorblindness, which we've all finally agreed upon and rejected white supremacy, how is it that the response to that among black people in cities could be massive race riots?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a more complicated story than that because the riots were, by and large, a phenomenon of northern cities, whereas the civil rights movement, by and large, transformed the South. So it wasn't really a one-to-one response, but it was certainly seen that way. Colorblindness, in a certain way, could be seen as ineffectual, as a false god, if the result of it could be such terrible turmoil and unrest. And so politicians began reaching for policies and rhetoric that puts race on the front burner in the opposite direction of Jim Crow. In other words, I'm going to appoint a black police chief. We're going to hire more black X. We're going to, very much the kind of thing that politicians were doing in the summer of 2020 as well, all competing to out race race rhetoric the next guy. So that's one thing that happened. And then right around that time is where you get the beginnings of the academic version of that. While politicians were doing it on that side, academics were creating the beginnings of critical race theory, which as an ideology is founded on the rejection of colorblindness. The rejection of colorblindness is central to what critical race theory saw itself as doing in the 70s. And part of what the critical race theorists did is that they rewrote the history of the civil rights movement and cut out colorblindness as the central force. Because if colorblindness is bad, it can't also have been the basis of the anti-slavery movement, of the long civil rights movement, starting in, with the NAACP in the early 1900s. So they very cleverly rewrote a history where colorblindness actually really had nothing to do with the good parts of the civil rights movement, and if anything, was really like a tool of the white supremacists all along.
Yeah, the white people are using it to game the political situation.
Right.
In
that's their narrative.
Yeah.
And so, that narrative is really totally false. And I dedicate, I think it's chapter 2 in my book called The Real History of Colorblindness to an examination of the fact that colorblindness has been at the core of the anti-slavery and then civil rights movements for 100 years.
Yeah. No, pretty incontrovertible, I think, from an historical viewpoint. But again, it's sort of like something I guess people want to believe, so they believe it. but it does seem to fly in the face of most of what we really know. And, then you have these things where people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin are sort of repurposed because at some time, at some place, they said something that sounds vaguely like they were, adjacent to critical race theory. So it's pretty remarkable. How much do you think when people buy into this stuff, people we know, people in the universities, people in professional life, just people you meet who are kind of liberalish, how much of this is preference falsification and how much of it is they really believe all of the above is true? In other words, are they saying what they think they have to say just because it's too inconvenient not to say it? Or, what percent of those people who would say those things really believe what they're saying?
I guess it depends what spaces you're looking at. I think if you're looking at a space like TED, where I tried to give a talk along these lines, I got the sense that really the vast majority of TED's audience was absolutely okay with my talk. Mm-hmm. It was really just a handful of employees who were upset by it and who punched far above their weight in terms of punched far above their numbers, and were able to kind of throttle the release of my TED talk and so forth. And it was a whole fiasco. People can read about if they're interested. But if an organization like that, which is really seen as having gone woke, is an indication, it still is a huge amount of preference falsification in terms of you got a small number of people that really believe something strongly, and you've got the other 95% of people that sort of quietly disagree with parts of it, or perhaps with all of it, but just don't really want to, but feel that they are falsely that they're in the minority, or they're afraid that they're in the minority.
Do you think that was true at Columbia?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that in my estimation, no more than 5 to 10% of the kids were true believers in wokeness. The vast majority of the kids were, first of all, probably like econ and finance majors, which is the most popular major. So it's like, if they have a politics, it's not very important to them. And the other kids may have had some, mixed sympathies. Some sympathies with wokeness, some sympathies with classical liberalism, and then there's a couple conservatives, But, I fluctuate between being of two minds about this. One is that really only 5 to 10% of the kids were woke, and the rest were cowed. But on the other hand, I talked to Eric Kaufman recently. He has a book diving into all this. And he makes a good point, which is that even if you're liberals and fully woke people kind of share the same sanctity in some way. They share the idea that identity is sacred in some way, that these are kind of sacred issues to different extents. And that makes it very difficult for liberals, for left liberals, to push back against wokeness, because it's in the same way that that it can be difficult for moderate Muslims to truly push back against jihadists, because they're just living by the more literal version of what you believe, what you do in fact believe. There's an element of that too. It's like if you concede like an inch in some ways to the idea that racial identity is this sacred component of your personality, that there's something to race that is more than skin deep, that racial gaps are evidence of racial discrimination, it becomes very hard to fight against the person who just takes all of those to their logical endpoints.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think what you're saying is that two beliefs come into conflict with each other, perhaps. One is that, for sort of the median liberalish person, they may have questions about this whole gamut of things, this whole vector of claims. I mean, they don't quite buy it. But on the other hand, they also believe in the sacredness of identity, how important that is, how that's almost a trump card, as it were, in these kinds of debates and discussions. So therefore, they keep their mouth shut, or they just wind up agreeing with, sort of the crowd on this stuff. because they can't reconcile those two beliefs. They can't make a choice, or if they do make a choice, they make a choice to be on the side of what everybody else is saying, because, identity's sacred. What do I know? Lived experience, all that kind of thing, which incidentally is something you talk about in your book, The Myth of Lived Experience, which has always been, one thing that's, as much as anything exemplifies a sort of vast illogic of a lot of these positions, because it simply makes no sense that, you can't pronounce it anything other than what you've had. If somebody's lived experience is different than yours, and if they're black or brown or whatever, their views must trump yours. It doesn't make any sense. What about facts? What about, our ability to reason? What about gathering evidence? I think the moment you concede to that, sort of the sanctity of, I guess it's related to identity, of lived experience, the game is lost, right? You can't have a discussion. You just can't.
Yeah, the other thing about that is what's suspicious is that it never goes both ways. So if it were true that I as a black person can just know certain things that you can't opine on, why would it not also be true that you as a non-black person would know certain things that are outside of my realm of knowledge? I don't see how it could only go one way without just being an expression of like reverse racial supremacy, right? If there is some principle here, it's got to be omnidirectional, or else it just makes no sense.
Right. Well, it's this lack of. Go ahead.
Yeah, and well, that kind of gives away what it's really about, which is it's just identity politics by other means. It's the politics of ethnic chauvinism dressed up in philosophical language.
Yeah, it's really racism, right? That's something you talk about a lot in your book. It's you call a spade in a sense. You say this, it doesn't just look like racism. It kind of is racism. It's neo-racism. It's like repurposing a lot of these social justice and philosophical tropes to wind up basically promulgating a type of racism. And I thought that was very, very brave of you, in a sense, to make that case, because I think that's something a lot of people shy away from, even people who don't agree with some of the excesses. If it's racism, it's racism, right? If you're discriminating and privileging one group against the other on racial grounds, that's racism. And it makes no sense for it not to be, as you say, omnidirectional. It's kind of bizarre.
Agreed.
So do you feel we're making progress on all this? Some people argue at this point we're post-woke peak, at any rate, that, it's been a little easier to have these kinds of discussions. There's been some movement in universities and other institutions to not be quite so crazy. But what do you think about that? Are we really making progress, or is it just like, or maybe it is past its peak, but it ain't very far past its peak. So we're still in a very different place than we were 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would settle right where you ended up there. I think, like you could say, if you're sitting in 1946, you could say, we're past peak violence, and you'd be right. But that's not exactly saying much, given that the peak was so insane. So, I think clearly the power of wokeness and its infiltration in institutions peaked in 2020 and 2021, and it's been going down since then. But it's not going anywhere. It's equivalent to a new religion, and the adherents of the religion, both the moderates and the extremists, are going to be with us, for many, many decades at the very least.
Yeah, they're institutionalized, right? Isn't that?
Yeah.
To me, that's a lot of the problem. It's not so much they're not randomly selected people in the population. They're people who have professional positions, academic positions, positions in whatever. They have institutional power. They have jobs. Their jobs are identified or bound up with that ideology and way of looking at things, and they ain't going anywhere. And I guess you could even make the argument, I'm curious how much you think this is a factor. This is how they make their living. It's their job. Right? Follow the money. At this point, there's still a lot of money in, sort of that whole sector, as it were. that is sort of identified with that religion, practices it to some extent, and is still managed to draw their paychecks from it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're at a university that is already very progressive and you're hired in the DEI department, I assume you understand that it's your job to basically enforce wokeness by whatever means you're able to, even if that's just stern emails or whatever. I don't even know what that job description would
be if you didn't context. Do that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, if you're hired to be DEI at Columbia in the DEI office, you've got wokeness is huge on campus. It's on everyone's lips. Everyone knows what it is, and you're the office that is meant to be the flame bearer, the torch bearer for that ideology. It's like I don't even know how your job could be different.
Yeah, right. No, I agree with that. I think that what you see is what you get. I mean, these people were hired to do X. They're going to do X. The more they do X, the more they believe it, and the more defensive they will be about anything that might get rid of it or cut down in their privileges or their paychecks or their positions or what have you. Well, one thing I'm curious about, Coleman, is would you say you're a conservative? Because you're often accused of being one, right? I think that Times article had it even in their headline. Are you a conservative? And if not, why not?
Well, I've never thought of myself as being a conservative. My entry into political thinking had, nothing to do with people like William F. Buckley or Roger Scruton or, George Will. These are just people that were barely on my radar when I first began sort of opining about subjects. So I'm not I didn't come from the tradition either of, recent Republican voting or the American conservative intellectual tradition. This is just not really part of my life. I know who these people are now. I've read some of these people now, and I see some wisdom in aspects of their philosophy, to be sure. But I can't call myself a conservative either in my personal intellectual journey or in the way I voted. So there's that reason that I don't identify as a conservative, just because I don't think of myself in those terms. And then if I just think about the philosophy of conservatism itself, I'm not a conservative, so I'm not the one to espouse this philosophy, but the basic idea is, the Chesterton's fence, right? Edmund Burke. It's like if you come across a fence in the wild, don't tear it down until you've really learned why it's there, right? It's the idea that the traditions and norms that your great-grandfather passed on to your grandfather, passed on to your father, passed on to you, even if they don't seem purely rational, they might have a rationale that you can't understand because it's a kind of inherited cultural wisdom that only looks rational when you take the long view, right? It's like Game of Thrones, right? These people for hundreds of years, they have this huge wall of ice around their kingdom, and they've forgotten who it's there to keep out. They know it's a sacred belief that you always guard the wall because there's this thing coming, and it turns out whatever it is that they come every 1,000 years, and you need the wall there. So the smart thing to do is actually to just shut up and listen to tradition. Don't try to come up with the most rational policy, because that, with your short-sighted human fallibility, that will actually lead to terrible outcomes. That's the idea of conservatism. So the thing is, I think that is right some of the time. That's right with certain policies. But there are other policies and traditions that are just bad traditions. And I think it's absolutely right to critique them from the point of view of reason and Enlightenment values and so forth, which is why I can't swallow conservatism hook, line, and sinker. I don't. What is it doing? What was it doing to ban gay marriage? What crucial aspect of our society was that preserving? I can't see it.
Yeah. Well, that has to do with the three-legged stool or whatever of form, fusion conservatism, right? The social conservatives, the foreign policy hawks, and the economic libertarians. They were all, a lot of them weren't. I mean, that really wasn't conservatism. It was a jerry-rigged political contraption. So things like banning gay marriage became bolted onto, conservative philosophy when they really didn't have a lot consistent with it necessarily. But I mean, looking at, sort of today, in real time, real policy time, I mean, there's a number of things in the areas you're particularly concerned with, sociocultural issues, where basically, I think it's fair to say conservatives frequently have a better point of view on this, or seemingly more grounded, sensible view on these things than liberals do. Do you think that that's fair to say? I mean, maybe none of us are conservatives or liberals anymore. We just need to pick and choose or something. But I mean, I want to give the devil his due here, so to speak. It does seem to me conservatives in real time are righter about some of these issues than the left. Yeah.
Well, I think almost anything having to do with race is such a deep blind spot for the left that by default conservatives tend to have a more reasonable point of view on it these days. Really almost anything to do with this sacred identity issues, which are the religion of the left. Conservatives, even by having just a passable halfway common sense point of view on it, they're going to seem like a beacon of reason. Like if the left is really saying that like Leah Thomas, that people born men who've had male puberty should compete against women, just the reaction against that, however inarticulate, is going to be more reasonable, right? And so there's 10 different issues like that where conservatives are making more sense. Now, then there are all the classic issues that conservatives haven't made, have been I think have had an identity-based resistance to viewing empirically. I would put gun control,
yes,
on that list, for example. So I completely share your point of view, your sense that, especially in the past few years, as the sacred identity issues have taken up so much airspace, the conservative reaction to most of them contains a good deal of common sense and good sense.
Yeah, thinking of where we are now, I mean, moving forward, we got your Democrats, we got your Republicans, we got Biden versus Trump. There are obvious problems with Trump, but in terms of the things we've been talking about, I mean, you have, where is the sort of the promulgator, the defender, the advocate of colorblind, approach and against neo-racism in the Democratic Party? They really don't exist, right? I mean, you had Biden going down to Morehouse College and giving this ridiculous speech to the graduating class about how, you have to work 10 times as hard as a white person to get far in life. Democracy doesn't like you. People are getting killed in the street. The poison of white supremacy, must be rooted out of our society. I mean, this is like pretty wild stuff, right? But it's certainly consistent with the narrative, though, with the identity-based narrative, things we've been talking about. And he's Mr. Democrat. He's the head of the ticket. And again, I don't see a lot of dissent even below the presidential level on this stuff. It seems like, despite what we were talking about earlier, we might be a little bit past the peak of wokeness. It still seems within the Democratic Party, writ large, it's still a pretty sacred thing, not to not to push back against this.
It's a sacred thing among Democrat elites, no doubt. Among rank and file Democrat voters, it's much less sacred, I think. And so, I think the past 10 years, there's been an opportunity for a Democrat who, obviously would have to have all of the kind of powers of charisma of great politicians, but who could sort of tap into the Democrat base that is not into the ideas or the language of wokeness, does not need to hear Hispanic people called Latinx, because none of us use that phrase actually. Doesn't need to hear all of these shibboleths, and has a more, first term Barack Obama type of message.
Yeah, but we don't see that person yet, I guess. They're not obvious on the horizon.
That person would have to fight with the white college-educated elite of the Democratic Party, which, despite not being like a huge number of people, it's not 50% of the Democratic Party. It's maybe 10%. I don't know, depending on how you
it's larger than that.
Define elite. I'm talking about elites though. So they would have to fight that contingent, which is a lot more powerful in terms of the sense-making institutions, as like Eric Weinstein would say. Like you'd have to fight against people at the New York Times, fight against people at NPR, fight against people at TED, and so forth. And so that is a fight that I think a lot of politicians would be way too daunted to undertake.
Do you think that part of it is one of the reasons why they might not be willing to take that on is maybe they don't understand the actual existing views of actually existing people of color, especially working class, blacks and Hispanics, who are, the way I read the data, and I think you've talked about this some too, they just aren't really on board with a lot of this stuff and not even very interested in it, right? So and that could be, I don't know what you think about this, one of the reasons why, in particular, non-white working class voters have been moving away from the Democrats in many places, is they know that's the narrative, that's the song, and they're not that interested in singing it. And so you could argue that if a Democratic politician had the guts to stand up for some of this stuff and just have a different approach, they might actually do better than you think among blacks and Hispanics, particularly working class blacks and Hispanics.
That is true. I mean, so your question is it that they don't know it?
Yeah, partly. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe some of them don't know it. I think a lot of them are smart enough and have their finger enough on the pulse that they actually do understand. And going into politics, unless you rocket to the top immediately, which almost nobody does, you have to spend a lot of time talking to normal people. And so I think that most of these politicians do basically understand, when push comes to shove, what the reality of the data you study is. But in an ecosystem where their status feels to them probably so mediated by like Twitter, which most Americans are not even on, I think a lot of them are taken in by the illusion that Twitter is real life, even if they know deep down it isn't. The constant feedback loop of what I said on CNN tonight, how are people reacting on Twitter? They're so deeply like living in that feedback loop that even if they know that there's all these voters who don't care about these issues, it's probably very difficult for them to actually act on that knowledge day in, day out.
Yeah, I suppose part of it too is it's a first mover problem, right? Somebody's got to do it, make that somewhat decisive break, and then the people who come after it will have it a lot easier. But no one wants to be that first person who, sort of lays it down and says, this is not what I believe, this is what I believe. This is wrong, this is right. I mean, somebody who did that would have probably the highest chance of not succeeding, but they would be the one who would make it easier for the people coming after them to succeed by taking that approach.
It's a very high-risk approach. I mean, this is what someone like Trump, in his own strange way, did in the Republican Party. It's like he fought. People always forget how deeply he was hated by the Republican establishment and by Fox News for a very long time. It was like first he was laughed at, and then he was hated, and then they all pretended to or came actually to love him and kiss the ring, Right. But you have to be willing as a politician to go through that, to really take a high risk approach and potentially fail, and certainly go through, months and months, if not years, of ridicule. And I think, most people are not willing to do that.
Yeah. I think that, look at you and me. We're not doing it.
Yeah,
Nor are people like us
exactly.
likely to do it. But, more power to them, whoever it is that finally does it. What do you see out there in terms of, that gives you hope in terms of, our sort of mini movement? I mean, clearly the Democrats and Republicans writ large are not vessels for this at this point. But do you think that, sort of the kinds of thinking that you and I and lots of other people, I think, more people by the day, believe in, that's not tied to the, sort of the Democrats and Republicans in a strictly partisan sense? Do you feel we're making progress? We're gaining at least a little bit of momentum? I mean, Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter frequently debate about this on their show.
I don't know if I'm optimistic. What does give me hope is that each new generation of children is an opportunity to re-enshrine the idea of colorblindness and not caring too much about race and treating people the same no matter what. And kids take to that ideology very easily. It's actually very intuitive for them. They only need to be told it once, and for most of them, it makes perfect sense. Why would I treat my friends differently based on how they look, right? Kids have many inherent flaws, such as often not wanting to share and so forth, but racial obsession is not one of them. And so that's what gives me hope, is that we always have, each generation is a new opportunity to get it right. And the war is never fully lost, even if it seems like it is.
I hear that. I mean, that's one reason I think why, there's a lot of effort put into training people out of color blindness in their younger years now in some educational settings, in some school systems. I mean, you actually have to make an effort to push these kids toward the idea that they shouldn't look at things in a colorblind way. They really should,
That's a great point.
sacralize race and sort of make it a key variable, which actually is one of the reasons why it may be difficult for the progress that you and I would like to see to be made, because there's a lot of entrenched educational interests who are sort of not interested in, our perspective, are really trained in a different perspective. The ed schools are what they are. The school administrators are who they are. Varies a lot by the area of the country, of course, but I think it's still a problem. But I agree with you. I think, you can't control generations. I think that's the great thing, right? The kids are kids, and they're gonna grow up in a different time than your cohort did, and they're gonna react to some of this stuff in a different way. There's some evidence that there's already a certain amount of pushback from Gen Z and even, the younger Gen Zs who aren't even in the electorate yet. There's like, what the hell? I mean, what is this stuff? I mean, it's not that cool to be woke anymore, right? It's not that much fun. It's puritanical.
That's the hope too, is that it was cool for people my age, but that's by definition will make it lame for people that are like 12 years old now.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, go 12-year-olds. Well, Coleman, I think that's a great place to end. Thanks for being on the Liberal Patriot Podcast. And, I mentioned where people can find you at the top of the podcast, your podcast, obviously the Free Press, other places, CNN. Anything else you want to add here before we sign off?
It was great to talk to you, Rui, and people can, if they want to see more of us, they can go check out our debate where we teamed up against Jamal Bowman and Alicia Garza. I remember that was fun.
Yeah, totally. People should check that out. It was a wild time, and I think Coleman and I made some good points. So, with that, we'll conclude this podcast, and I'll see, our millions of podcast listeners in a couple of weeks for the next podcast. Thank you.